Thank you very much for showing up. I wasn't sure whom and how many to expect between, well, impeachment aftermath and primary premonitions, but apparently there are a lot of people also interested in other issues than that. And as I assume, or those are issues at the heart of my interest, I hope you find them important as well. I will maybe start with giving you a very brief overview as to what I try to cover, and then we'll see how far we actually get within the 45 minutes or so that we thought we would have for that. And also in order to have some time for some questions, answers, not least because I also find that usually very rewarding, because I've had similar talks other places earlier, also this year, also this month, and it's no matter how much I know the topics, there are always things I or other colleagues haven't thought about, or it's very interesting to see and hear how others respond to some of the topics presented. So, without further ado, I'll try to start with a brief outline. So, apart from an introduction, I will talk about what I entitled Mass Migration Misconceptions, because I think that's very important in the current debate, both here and in Europe, including Scandinavia, that those terms and topics sometimes are mixed up, sometimes intentionally. A little bit about the international protection regime, and then why the distinction between the various expressions and terms matters. Some dangers en route, because usually, of course, people fleeing for various reasons, their place of origin are already vulnerable per se, and of course then also more vulnerable to being caught up in smuggling or even trafficking rings. And then I will return to what is kind of at the start of it all, what drives people to leave their place of origin. We have drivers, we have push, and we have pull factors. I will briefly mention that before hopefully returning to something slightly more uplifting, because some of those topics are rather somber, and I try to look at some positive developments taken not least from the Sub-Saharan African context, which is where I currently have a major focus on. But before I move on, maybe very briefly a note on the logo, meaning the logo that you see the bottom there. And that is inspired, at least the H7 that you see in the Human Rights Research League logo is inspired by actually from Håkon, or King Håkon, the seventh. That's why it's H7. He was the king of Norway also during World War II, and when the Germans came and occupied Norway, he fled to London and organized the resistance from there. And people, population in Norway, those that tried to show some sign of resistance, even if they were not otherwise actively probably involved, I mean some were very actively involved in the resistance, then used a coin, which is a wartime coin with the H7 symbol on their jacket label, and this is what I do right here also, and that is, I will show you a bigger image of that as well, and that's what all members of the Human Rights Research League tend to wear on their jacket label whenever they speak in public. Probably you can see it here if it works. If not, I have another. So what comes up next would be a bigger image of that coin. So the H7 you see. No, you don't. It's only on mine. Then forget about what I said and look at this one. That's the same one I have on the label here. And then it's actually also this one, original wartime coin. And people would wear that on their label, or would draw H7 on houses, or draw it in the snow, H7 as a sign of resistance, and in honor of that tradition, and in order to as a reminder that you shall never take human rights and freedoms for granted. We also, as the Human Rights Research League, use that and therefore also integrated that into our logo. But roughly or quickly, back to the introductory part. So that much for the logo. As to the topic, or the broader topic at least, what I try to convey here is something that actually started in Lubumbashi, which is in this old, down the southeast of the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it is a tale of, well, man versus women as well. It's a tale of specifically women's empowerment. And from my point of view, also a symbol of the predicament in which pretty much everyone who flees his or her country of origin finds themselves. That means they're torn between where they fled from and where they fled to. But to that in a little while, just to give you an image as to where it is. So all the way here in the center, and all the way down here would be Lubumbashi. All this is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And since we, the Human Rights Research League, currently also have a number of projects there, including in Lubumbashi. I had the opportunity to visit with UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, several so-called urban refugee projects, because they try to, these days, with the out-of-camp policy, they try to have projects where they give microfunds to groups of refugees in order for them to be self-sufficient eventually, and they try to create projects from which, or based on which they eventually can be self-sufficient. Usually groups of 10 people, and because the UNHCR has many other UN operations these days, pretty much everyone is, each one is underfunded. 40 to 60% maximum usually of the money needed is coming forth. So they decided to change that or do something else with it. So they give microfunds to each of those 10 people, supposedly under the requirement that they create a project that is sustainable, and if they reach certain targets, they get some more funding. And I mean, that means less than $100 per person, usually much less. But in that context, it's not that little. And they did that, and I visited some of those. One was a group of men who had as a business plan to create something like a bar, and there, after a rather short period of time, one guy had sold out or forced out all the others and was like the only one in charge of that bar. And whether that went well or not, in any case, it shows that even if the project would move on, then it would only benefit him. He didn't even have a family, versus the other group was a group of women that I'll turn to in a second, and they organized something that turned out to be a small restaurant, and they worked on that for several years. Some had been there for 5, 6, 7 years, and made it rather successfully, and organized themselves with rotating leadership, etc., and created something that was sustainable. And just to return to this briefly, this is maybe an hour or so outside of Lubumbashi, which is a city of several million people, second largest in the DRC. But we still had an hour or so to go. So when I use the term urban refugee, it's a very relative term. It's rather rural areas where they then lived. But anyways, it started all with a trip to the southeast. And these women then, when I was there, had actually, it was a happy day for them because the project was successful. They had been able now, while we were visiting for the first time, to actually send off their children to school with their own money. So everyone who sends children to school in the DRC has actually to pay for a certain school fee is not provided by the state, and even though it's not a lot for most people, since very many are very poor, including the Congolese who live there themselves, cannot afford that. And those women here fled from the neighboring countries back then, from Burundi, Rwanda, some came as far from Uganda, but somehow all ended up in Lubumbashi in the southeast of the DRC. They fled violence, and most of them had been raped, and the children they had now were from that persecution and from those rapes. But still, they managed to create something for themselves here, and we're very proud that they finally had managed to create a life and send their first offspring, their children, to school. And so I had the privilege of meeting them there and talking to them, and of course working on refugee issues in general and then meeting a lot of people in that predicament. It hit me that I was curious to find out how would they look at the future and how do they look at their, well, still home country. And I mean, they were realistic enough to consider that, well, this is home now. Some of them, as I said, have been there for about 7 years when the out-of-camp policy first was implemented, in part, in the DRC by UNHCR, had been living there for many years, but still, they were torn. They said they still dreamt of one day going back and not least showing their children where they're actually from, and had a hard time, although they accepted in that sense where they were now. They still were in that predicament where you can't decide, shall you consider this entirely and only this your home now, or should you still aspire to one day move back? And what is true of them is most definitely true in other cases as well, whether we will look at those that travel from Africa, trying to get to Europe, maybe getting stuck in Libya and then being in some of those situations we've seen often also on TV of living in dungeons or being trafficked by those that exploit them on their way to Europe. That the same may be true for the so-called caravans that we see these days now from the south and central of America coming to our doorsteps here. And what I want to use this story for is a reminder that very few people that I've met, or very few people in general, flee without having a compelling reason. Not all of them may have reasons that fall under what we will briefly see in a few minutes, the so-called Refugee Convention or various variations of that, so they may not have conventional grounds, but very few people do not at least have compelling grounds and grounds that they simply feel the need to flee, and in that sense fall at least under the paradigm of forced migration. And that leads me to some of the common misconceptions in the world of migration, and that's why I usually want to, or usually integrate at least a minute or two on that in a talk. When we talk about migrants versus refugees, asylum seekers, etc., what are the differences? Because they are often used interchangeably, at least in, not least in public and popular discourse, and definitely in populist discourse, though they should generally be kept apart also, or not least when it comes to the discussion of the rights attached to each respective status. So we could say migrants would be the overall term for all those we subsequently see here. Refugees would be those that fall under the Refugee Convention in several variations. I will show those. Asylum seekers, one might see, are those that have made a claim to RSD, but their RSD, their refugee status determination, has not been finalized yet. And then, of course, we have, and that's the case in all movements of, or mass movements of people, so-called mixed migration flows, and we talk about double or triple meaning, and that pertains to the fact that in each group, whether that's a caravan or something else, of people, you see some that have conventional grounds falling under the Refugee Convention. You have others who may flee for economic or other reasons to seeking a better future, but you often, or more often than not, have also people that have several competing grounds. You may flee because you are looking for better opportunities, but at the same time, you may be persecuted at home. So within yourself, you may keep both, and it is nothing that says in the Refugee Convention that you may not also, on top of or in addition to a conventional ground, have economic or other reasons, as long as at least one of those 5 conventional grounds are fulfilled. That is, you would still be considered a refugee. And another, well, misconception that one still often sees, again, especially in populist discourse, is that we're talking about unprecedented numbers when it comes to arrivals. And that is really not true. If we look at it more closely, then we could see that these days about 70 million people are what we could define as forced migrants. And that could be either refugees, asylum seekers, but also, which I'll briefly explain later, IDPs, internally displaced persons. So those that forcefully are displaced. But as a matter of fact, as late as, or as early as during the Second World War and then the years immediately following, scholars have estimated that about 200 million people had been displaced during that time. And if we then on top of that compare that to the actual number of people living on Earth now versus back then, that means back then about 10% of the global population those years following World War II were displaced. And today that would mean actually less than 1%. So unprecedented, not at all. And that means it is doable to take care of that, not least because if you also then compare how the economy looked like in the years after 1945, as opposed to today, of course, we're much better placed and have many more resources to manage it, or manage forced mass migration. But of course, one problem is even 70 million, of course, is a huge number. And if you look at huge numbers, there's always that problem of drowning in numbers. It was written, I think, in the Holocaust Memorial in Yad Vashem. And by the way, I think that recently came up again because I think at the end of January, 27th of January this year, it was 75 years ago after since the liberation of Auschwitz. So I think there was written something like 1 or 2 are persons, something along the lines, 1 or 2 or 3 people, those are persons, but 5 million or so, those are just numbers. So if you have 2 large numbers, I guess humanity kind of drowns in that, and that is some of the problem with mass migration and forced migration. So it's important to keep that in mind, and to keep in mind that before we have decided and looked at each particular case, those are, well, in any case, people, and we need an individual assessment of each particular case before moving on and making hasty judgments. I said briefly, I would say a few words on the protection regime. We have what we call the refugee definition, which is what is written in the UN 1951 Refugee Convention. We have similar, pretty much all are based, similar definitions or laws based on the Refugee Convention in the European Union, like the Qualification Directive, in the 1969 OAU, that is the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, Refugee Convention, and of course in the INA here in the US. They're all based on the UNHCR Refugee Convention and are very similar, although probably the African one is a little bit more, has a lower bar on certain issues. And that means, roughly speaking, a refugee as any person who wants to welcome the fear of being persecuted based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, needs or is persecuted and may not apply or is unwilling to wed him or herself of the protection of his or her home country. And then we have something that is more human rights based, refugee law, if you will, not the convention directly, but developed from there, something we call subsidiary protection, and that is, in short, a person who does not qualify as a refugee under the convention, but has would still face a real risk of serious harm, and that is something similar to what is also in the Convention Against Torture, when you may not be returned, even if you would not necessarily fill the refugee convention. And then as a minimum bar is also the Article 33 in the Refugee Convention, which states that even if you may probably not fill the reasons in the Refugee Convention, or in any case your country would not confer the right of refugee status to you, you may still not be returned to another country, wherever you may be targeted because of those 5 reasons. So that's the absolute minimum bar, and that is something that is also in the recent debate here regarding travel bans, not necessarily sufficiently been taken into account. I might return to that if we have sufficient time. And finally, IDP, like the internally displaced persons, there's a convention for them, that's the Kampala Convention, and you might say that it's almost a mirror image of the Refugee Convention. Main difference being they had not been able, or in any case have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. And there's some extra differences also. You could also flee based on natural or human-made disasters, which is currently at least not part of what would confer or convey refugee status to you, but IDP status definitely. And I mention IDPs towards the end of those definitions, but not least because I think technically they're probably even worse off than many refugees. And that is based on, that was too quick, based on the fact that there are actually more, first of all. When we talk about 70 million, 40 of those are internally displaced persons. And why is that the case? Well, because in the past couple of decades at least, the majority of the armed conflicts have been domestic conflicts. And as we saw briefly in the definitions, they have similar reasons of flight as refugees, but they did not or could not cross the border, and they have thus no, what I call here, external protection. They are still under the protection of the same government that could not protect them or prevent them from being or feeling the need to flee. And worst case, often the governments were probably part of or the reason for their displacement. And since there still are within the same country, they did not or could not cross an international border, that's all they have. Then on top of that, it's often underreported. There was, for example, I use the DRC example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There was a year and a half ago, while Kabila still was president there, a donor conference in Europe where donors pledged $200 or $300 million for IDPs in the DRC, and initially the DRC government wouldn't even show up because they were offended that the number of IDPs in their country had been placed to close to 5 million, which is what today actually is the case. 5 million, about 5 million people are internally displaced in the DRC, and the government was offended because they thought that number was too high and it didn't look good for the upcoming elections, that the numbers were that high. So they initially wouldn't even come, and after a long time of back and forth, only then did they show up to actually receive money for their people. I mean, that says something about such governments, and I have a word or two on that eventually as well. Furthermore, we see the CNN effect at work in those cases. If you compare it, for example, to the 2004 tsunami in Thailand, and back then, during just a couple of days after, and from that day on, the international community pledged more money to Thailand and to the victims of tsunami than during that year for the entire continent of Africa. And again, I said, just in the DRC would be 5 million internally displaced persons. If we take all of Africa together, and if we on top of that, of course, include all the refugees within that continent, then that says a lot about that continent, but even more about us, because of course, well, I guess one of the main reasons that mostly Western donors were very eager to pledge money back then was also because some of their own, or some of us, were directly affected by that. Well, I guess I'd drop some of the special cases, but you could conceive of forced confinement of a population when the population cannot move at all, even though they could not even technically be refugees. It's not like they didn't cross the border, but they could not even move, like say in Gaza. So it could also be a case of special case of IDPs. And the same is now in a very recent case before the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, where Gambia had a case against, or still has, against Myanmar, and made the ICJ pronounce a statement of order ordering Myanmar to, well, not attack even more, or continue to attack the Rohingya population who are still inside Myanmar. Quickly on problems with the IDP protection, meaning problems in the Kampala Convention on IDP protection, and that is mainly you don't have very many enforceability mechanisms. We have one where the African Union might intervene in a member state, but that is pursuant to a decision of the Assembly, and of course in the Assembly may be several states who would not vote for that because they would be afraid that the African Union would intervene in their own state, because they probably have been sitting for too long and based on unconstitutional grounds in their current seats as presidents, etc. And the second aspect is simply, well, the African Union may also intervene if a state party so requests, but that means that only very responsible state parties would do, because they would like to stay in power. So those that are not very democratically elected would most likely not invite the African Union to intervene. But it's an instrument that is promising, but the ratification status, I guess the link doesn't work, so I'll give you the numbers directly, is still a challenge. There are 40 out of 55 state parties who have actually signed, but just, well, 29 of them ratified. And among those that have not yet ratified the Kampala Convention are some of the states with the largest IDP population still, including, for example, the DRC. And that was also part of what we tried to, or are in the process of trying to accomplish in the DRC with some of the projects. We had just last year in October a 3-day conference which Human Rights Research League, along with UNHCR and the International Committee of the Red Cross and the African Union organized in order to, well, find durable solutions to internally displaced persons and refugees, trying to have more of an interaction with the host communities in that out-of-camp policy, but not least to also get or push the DRC government to finally ratify the Kampala Convention. We'll see how that goes, but on the positive side, the guy in the middle is the important guy here. That's Gilbert Kakonde Malamba, and that's the vice premier minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So he was there, and there were probably 20 or so people from the ministries and government officials present, along with academics and humanitarian actors of all kinds, so 150 people or so, and he was there, the governor was there for all 3 days, which is not often the case. He was also there while a memorandum and communique was adopted. Here's the second from the left here as well. And, well, was there, listened in, and was even there towards the end when that communique was finally adopted. And that, of course, is not the same thing as ratification, but it's like an oral statement that they accepted what had been discussed, and they had been part of the discussions. And now, of course, the work continues because we need to get them to actually ratify the Kampala Convention, because then at least another, say, 5 million people would have some legal recourse where they could claim their rights if one could get the current government to at least act in this way. But then a word or two on why, what I initially mentioned, the distinction between refugees, entities, etc., asylum seekers, and other regular or economic or other migrants matters. By the way, talking about the overriding term, if we look at migrants in general, at any given time there are probably 260 million, but that then would include regular migrants who work as well. Right now I would be technically a migrant, because this time I'm here on a J1 and a work visa. Other times when I come as a tourist, I would not fall under that term. But back to forced migrants, asylum seekers, etc. Everyone has the right to seek asylum, seek protection, seek refugee status if you have, well, a perceived need and fled your country. But on the other hand, of course, we have the state or states that have a right to immigration and border control. And also, they're not under the obligation to grant asylum. Most countries are under the obligation to grant asylum, but they are under the obligation to review each individual asylum claim and proceed to well, a regular RSD, refugee status determination. The outcome of that, of course, then varies. And what we saw now, both in Europe, those are from the early 2010, 11, 12 cases in the European Court of Human Rights, similar issues are in the latter years coming now to, well, to the doorstep here with the so-called caravans and the travel ban cases, is that, yes, you could say that if a, say, refugee or assumed refugee travels through other countries before coming to a European country, or in this case, before coming to the US, then one might be tempted to say, well, you could have applied somewhere else, so we would not even look at your case, because now you already passed through Guatemala or somewhere else, and since you didn't apply there, then we'll just send you back, or we don't even review your case. And that would overlook one decisive fact, and that is that, yes, there's something that's called the third country rule, but it's called the safe third country rule. So you might say if someone crossed over or crossed into your country and on the way already past another country, you would be tempted to send him or her back. And technically you could do that, but only if you had a very careful evaluation of the situation in that country, the human rights, etc. situation in that country, or also for that particular person. So if you're, and for that reason you cannot send someone back without even looking at the case, and then disregarding that maybe the situation where you would send someone back to would mean that they would be targeted there just because you think, well, your fault, since you didn't even ask for protection on the way. Those cases have been decided also be, as I said, before the European Court of Human Rights, because there were also some faults made. For example, Belgium back then sent people back to Greece, thinking, well, both EU countries, so I guess the standards are okay, but during that time at least, Greece was overwhelmed, it did not have any proper asylum procedures in place. That's why the European Court said, well, not just Greece is at fault because they didn't have sufficient asylum procedures in place, but Belgium as well, because they blindly just made it easy for themselves and shifted people back to Greece, where most would have arrived initially, because it's one of the borders to the south of the European Union, where a lot of people would, fleeing, for example, Africa, etc., would land there first, one of the port of entries, and something similar was the case in the Italy case. Well, this I will not touch because we don't have much time for that, but as I said, and it's obvious, as a refugee or asylum seeker, you're, or forced migrant in general, you already fall under the very vulnerable population definition, if you will, and then of course you're more likely to fall prey to human smugglers and or human traffickers. And also when we raise the bar to asylum, legal and physically, then of course more and more people, if they can, procure or try to get the help of smugglers to even cross the border on their way to at least potential safety. So smuggling we have as an issue, we have human trafficking that may be result. For example, you got help to cross the border and then what you pay to a smuggler all of a sudden triples or tenfold the amount, and then you are in a, at least at the latest then you might very easily be in a situation of exploitation, which is more often than not the case also among those that we see en route, whether it's the caravans or whether it's the, say, African movements towards the north. This I will probably drop it or explain very briefly. It's a special case of trafficking where the court for the first time, that was in the United Kingdom, made a case that even sitting diplomats could, who are usually protected from such things, could be judged as having taken part in a human trafficking ring if they employ persons who had been trafficked, as opposed to simply, being regarded as white-collar crimes and maybe for salary dumping or something like that, because they probably didn't pay a lot for the person they hired. This was a diplomatic agent who hired a house help. But no, the court said that according to the supply chain theory, the relevant activity is not just the so-called employment, but the trafficking itself. So the employer of the migrant is an integral part of the supply chain, and thus could be charged with human trafficking as well. And I think that's a very strong symbol or symbolic judgment, although this was, as stated, it's an obiter dictum, so it was something the court stated beyond the actual case, because the actual case was not an incumbent diplomat, but someone who had been a former diplomat. To return briefly to, well, those are just descriptions of or graphic descriptions of the most common migration routes as we see, both from South and Central Europe to South and Central America to the US, and then also Africa, whether they cross through Libya or Morocco, etc. And Lampedusa would be the port of entry to Italy eventually, Lampedusa, and kind of like in the middle, on the right of Tunisia. But what they all have in common is, was I said initially, their push and their pull factors, and those we call the drivers of forced migration, and most often those include protracted refugee, protracted conflict, political violence, crisis, etc., but also, well, economic factors, natural disasters, etc. They are often interrelated, and there's some reciprocity between the terms. Not all of those, of course, would fall under the refugee convention or conventional grounds, because economic factors, as I said, would not account for that. But I mentioned it nevertheless because as I said, we have mixed migration flows, and often you do not necessarily flee only for one reason, but for being considered a refugee, it's sufficient that at least one of your reasons falls under that convention, or pertains to some of those grounds. And then if you look at how the situation on the ground is for people coming from say, less developed countries, then you probably would understand that, or one would understand that one objective reason may lead to another, because if this is, for example, how your city would look like. This is Limete. It's one part of Kinshasa, which is the capital of the DRC, capital of probably 10 million people. And what you see, if you can see it, is actually almost all of it are plastic bottles and some other trash. And that is a tributary to the Congo River, so side river. And since they lack entirely waste disposal systems there, then every now and then, especially during the rainy season almost every day, it floods. And floods and there are inundations, and not just does it look bad, but regularly people die from that. So you could say in theory, it's just you know, if you would flee because of that, you could say it's because of the situation. It doesn't look like a very good economic situation there, but obviously it has actually a deadly effect. And I use that picture just as a symbol of the, say, state of a state, or how bad it looks in some states. And that is also a symbol, in my opinion, as to where wrote on one of the slides, hopelessness. Hopelessness, of course, is not a refugee ground, but it makes it more understandable if that, on top of other reasons, is what you have to live with daily. And then we have pull factors, usually the mirror image of the push factors. So if you are targeted at home or have no freedom of expression, etc., then that would be a push factor, and the pull factor would be the opposite, that you then seek protection, seek political freedom, etc., in another country. And as I said, they are not all related to refugee or conventional grounds under the Refugee Convention, but that is also because we talk about mixed migration flows, so there are often parallel reasons, and that is fully legitimate. Towards the end, I want to point out what I actually consider the most serious reasons, and that are the so-called drivers of forced migration in terms of underlying root causes. So we look at the push and pull factors as drivers, then one might ask oneself, why is that the case? Why do we have that much, say, armed conflict or hopeless situations or bad conditions in a country? And more often than not, that is because of, well, you could call it bad governance, you could call it the denial of alternation in some, for example, because I work there quite a lot these days, but it might also be in other countries, in the Sub-Saharan African countries, whether it's the Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, etc. There have been governments in place partly for 30 years or more. Same president, changing the constitution by unconstitutional means, caring more about sitting in power than caring about the population, including, as I said, when you don't even come to a conference to accept money for your IDPs, that says probably it all. And if you have such a government, then of course that usually entails or leads to, mostly both, mismanagement, embezzlement, corruption, etc. Or you could say the repression of negative human rights, not being targeted by the government, so National Convention on Civil and Political Rights, or the non-provision of positive human rights, access to health, etc. would be a positive human rights that then would be hard to find. And then, of course, we could also say a lack of alternation, the fossilization of political systems, etc., could be regarded as a lack of rule of law. And if we talk about that, we of course need to look very briefly at what is the rule of law, and that could be one definition of it. The most common part of it is probably a law that guarantees everyone's individual freedoms against interventions by government or other citizens, and also that there's a separation of power between legislature, executive, and the judiciary. And of course, that was something I just a couple of weeks ago talked to my LLM law student from international class of law students in Ohio, and they came from countries as far as Zimbabwe, Kenya, Nigeria, South Sudan, and not least meaning they came from countries where you would not expect that the rule of law is taken well care of, and that is also obviously the fact that they came to Ohio, in this case Ohio, in order to learn about things including the rule of law, to take that back to their home country and try to implement some of the changes there. And of course, when I then, was it just yesterday, heard or learned about, or we all heard, that all four prosecutors in the Roger Stone case resigned following the DOJ's backpedaling in the aftermath of, well, certain tweets. I guess the direct timeline one would have to establish eventually, but I can at least tell you that much, that it's tough to sell that to my students then. And in the sense that, great getting back to them in a couple of weeks and surely getting questions about that. Not a good thing. What you would expect is, this is for example, a police station just half an hour or so outside Kinshasa. Because, well, they're not regularly, if at all, paid. That means their payment is from bribes. And there, of course, you would expect certain meddling to appear or take place constantly, and it does take place constantly, but maybe not so much in, well, let's use a general term, Western democracies. So finally, I said I would try to come up with a few more positive things towards the end, what could be done or what may be done. In general, when we try to see what we can change or do, we look at a two-pronged approach. Obviously, we need to fight underlying root cause, but also help those who already live in a state of refuge or are negatively affected by those root causes. My point of view is that we need to focus much more on the underlying root causes, which, for example, would be unconstitutional change of government or lack of change of governments, etc. Because otherwise we just continue producing even more. But of course, those who are already living in a state of refuge, we have to help as well. And then, how do we do that? Well, we look at why or what makes people flee, what makes them stay in a state of refuge, and what makes them return. And for that, there is well, new terminology we call the triple nexus, but that basically means that one should also integrate more humanitarian actors with development actors and peace and security actors. So MONUSCO or the say military arm of the United Nations, along with humanitarian actors and those that deal with development, because usually the international community only comes in when, well, the crisis already happens. And some of the crisis, whether it's non-conflict or say poverty in general, could have been avoided if one had been going in earlier, and along with the development actors, and invest in countries, invest in integration of refugees, IDPs, etc., for example, in host communities who are often equally poor, and not wait until a conflict already again explodes. So that's the very short version of the triple nexus. And the other two positive points that one at least could see is there's actually positive potential. And since I mostly these days looked at Sub-Saharan Africa, because there's more, or the most potential is there, I use that expression or example. It's the region with the fastest growing and youngest population, and by 2050 it will double actually population there in all of Sub-Saharan Africa. So the Congo will go from 100 to 200 million people, for example. And they have almost a reversed age pyramid compared to Europe or the United States, etc. And then we call that, usually you could say they have a democratic dividend, or it could be a comparative advantage, as it was for the so-called Asian tigers in the, I think, late 80s, if well managed, if that population growth is well managed. And that means, at least for Africa especially, investing much more in education, higher education, and focusing not least on education of women and girls, which is very much underdeveloped there, and because of that, of course, it's also a huge untapped potential. And finally, other improvements we see is on the rule of law level. There is actually one recent case where that's the African Code of Human and People's Rights in Action pour la Protection des Droits de l'Homme, which is a human rights group there, against the Ivory Coast, held a case before that African court. And to the surprise of many, because often we would not yet expect them to come up with strong judgments, they actually decided that the makeup of the so-called Independent Electoral Commission in the Ivory Coast gave advantage to the incumbent president, hence violated the principle of equal protection, which was one of the first cases where it actually has been stated, and that is at least promising to see. But as of now, the situation for many will remain a situation of a perceived need to leave and flee and seek other protections. And that brings me to the back, or to the beginning, brings me back to the beginning. People will few times, if ever, leave their homes for or without compelling reasons, even if it does not be, even if they do not fall on the conventional grounds. We do have mixed migration flows. All migration flows are mixed, and there's no uniform mass. And prior to RSD, prior to a proper refugee status determination, we don't know their case. We don't know who they are. We need to evaluate their case before we even make a statement. And I think we need to keep in mind that the numbers are really not historically high, and thus also we need to avoid using what often is used interchangeably, because it should be kept, or those expressions should be kept apart. And I will end thus with a plea that in all the heated discussions here in Europe and other places these days regarding border and immigration control and erecting bars to asylum, to protection, physical and legal ones, that we we need to keep a sense of perspective and not overlook the human being or the, say, little man in the bigger picture. So the question is, do you see him? Thank you.